Christ does not interfere in free will. And that's kind of the paradox we live in as human beings. If we had no free will, then we would be no different than the animal kingdom. And that everything we did, in a sense, was done out of instinct. Then how would God know? Or even we know ourselves, whether or not our love for God was based on free will or based on instinct. And so we live in that tension where God does give us the power to choose, which is an incredible power he gives us as human beings. In God's attempt to make us be provided with choices. And those choices are to choose God or to choose the antithesis of God. And that's what we're faced with as human beings. And that's why Christ comes. That's how Satan, by the way, that's how Satan became Satan. Because of Lucifer, his name in the scriptures, Lucifer could not accept a God who was incarnate. A God who was fully human. Not just took on human flesh, but was fully human. Because when God became incarnate, he lowered himself below the realm of the angels, below the nature of the angels. Angels are pure spirits. They don't have corporeal bodies like we do. They're much brighter, much smarter. They travel much quicker. I could go for a little of that. And their clarity of free will is much more heightened than ours is. Which is why when they rebelled against God, they knew, because of their clarity of free will, that their decision was flawed. Whereas we ourselves, our decisions are oftentimes clouded by our human nature. Which is why in God's mystery of his love for us, reaches out by sending the Son. In 2004, John Paul II sent a directive through our present Pope, who at that time was Cardinal Ratzinger, who was the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, mandating every bishop in the world to select and train an exorcist. In 2005, our bishop decided to appoint an exorcist because of a growing number of requests for exorcism, or at least investigations into diabolical or potential diabolical matters at hand. And so, quite honestly, the first priest the bishop appointed, or wanted to appoint, declined. And that priest happened to mention it to me. And in a very naive way, I simply said, I could be the exorcist. I believe in the personification of evil, which I did say, which I do believe. I could do that. So that priest then said, well, do you mind if I tell PJ? And I said, no, that's okay. So he told Bishop McGraw. And I was coming to the end of my 12-year term as pastor of St. Nicholas. And I was going on a sabbatical to Rome. But it wasn't at that time to study exorcism. And so the bishop said, by the way, there's a course you can take while you're in Rome. And it was at the Legionaries of Christ Seminary at the Regina Apostolorum, which is outside of the sort of the old city, but it's in the city, but it's kind of a bit out there. Very beautiful seminary. And so in the fall of 2005, as Anne mentioned before, I began the course on exorcism. And there were about 60 people in the course. The priests were mostly all Italians. The women religious were mostly all Africans. And there were 3 Americans. Me and Matt Bagglio, the writer of the book, whom I never had met in my life. I didn't even know this man, Matt Bagglio, even existed until I took this course. And there was a 3rd priest who unfortunately died, God rest him, about 18 months ago. A priest by the name of Father Johannes Switzer, who was a Franciscan and unfortunately developed Lou Gehrig's disease and died 18 months ago. So when I began the course, Father Switzer was working himself as an apprentice at a very famous church, at a chapel at a very famous church called St. John Lateran. How many of you guys have been to Rome? How many of you have ever been to St. John Lateran? Okay. On the same property, St. John Lateran, by the way, it's actually the Cathedral of Rome. So it's actually the Pope's church. St. Peter's Basilica is not the Cathedral of Rome. St. Peter's Basilica is part of Vatican City, where obviously the Pope and the central governance of the church exists. But John Lateran is actually the Cathedral of Rome. And across the piazza there's a chapel that's probably about 5 times the size of our cathedral, and it's called the Scala Santa, which means Holy Stairs. And in that chapel, the Holy Stairs that St. Helen, the mother of Constantine, had brought back from Jerusalem, which were allegedly the stairs that Jesus walked up when he faced Pontius Pilate, when Pontius Pilate condemned him to death. And supposedly there are the stains of his blood in the wood, and they're covered in plexiglass. And in that chapel there was a priest, I'm not sure if he's still living, but he was 85 at the time, and he was performing exorcisms in that church every day. And this priest, Father Switzer, was helping him. So I would go to class, Matt and I and Johannes would be at class, and I would be hearing all these stories. And we would be taking the class, and it was all in Italian, and I had a translator. And it became very apparent to me that I needed more than this class. So without going into all the minutiae and all the details of how I found Father Carmen de Fipolis, it wasn't easy. I went to the Cardinal Leveda, who took the Pope's place as prefect for the congregation, and he's from the former Archbishop of San Francisco, and I knew him. And I said, do you know if there's any English-speaking Italian exorcists in Rome? And there's 9 exorcists in Rome, and none of them spoke very much English. And so I happened to be studying Italian, so I knew more Italian than Father Carmen knew English. And actually, very interestingly, and I'm sure this wasn't by coincidence, on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade on January 22nd, 2006, Father Carmen agreed to take me as an apprentice. And so the next day, on a Monday, on a Sunday morning, the next day, I began showing up at St. Lawrence outside the Walls Basilica, and Father Carmen, on average, would see maybe about 12 people on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursday afternoons between 3:30 and 6:30. So I would go out, and I had the ritual in Latin on my lap, and he would bring people into a room off of his office, and he would, in some cases, exorcise them, and in some cases, pray deliverance prayer over them. And so in the 3.5 months that I worked with Father Carmen, I observed probably about 80 exorcisms, and that's the number that's used in the book. And I think that's a pretty accurate number, although I didn't tally them or keep track. But based on the number of exorcisms and the number of days I was out there, it was probably in the neighborhood of 80 exorcisms. And then I came home and I was made pastor of Sacred Heart, and started on May the 1st, 2006. There are many people in our Western society who think, in the present culture, that Satan is a metaphor. Biblical scholars, sometimes even Catholic biblical scholars, and sometimes even professors of theology in Catholic seminaries and even some bishops, not ours, but others, will say Satan in the scriptures is a metaphor. He's a symbol of evil, but he's really not. He doesn't exist in any kind of real way. I'm here to say to you, from a first-hand observation, that he does exist. And that we've taught this down through time, through the scriptures. And it is a teaching of the church. And it is in the catechism of the Catholic Church. And it's not taught as a metaphor. And Satan's greatest con job, his greatest attempt at deception, is to convince us that he doesn't exist. That's his greatest lie. Because that's what Satan is all about. Satan is all about lies and deception. And that if we believe he doesn't exist, then Satan is much more free to continue creating havoc in lives of people, and also to enticing people to be drawn really to a life of paganism. I see a lot of people in this ministry since I've been the exorcist. Before, when I was not the exorcist, I never, in all my 22 years as a priest up to that point, I had never ever had anybody come and talk to me about things of Satan or demonology, ever. I have people come talk to me about seeing their loved ones who had died appear to them in a variety of places, and I do think that can happen. I don't understand how it can happen for some but not for others, but I do know that that can happen. But I had never had anybody come and talk to me about anything in the realm of the satanic. Many people who come to me today are people who, for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into, for a variety of reasons, have dabbled in the spiritual world and realm that is outside the confines of classical religion. Benedict XVI, about a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago, made this quote, but I can't give you the exact words, but I'll give you the paraphrase. He said, as faith diminishes, superstition increases. When John Paul II called for every bishop in the world to select and train an exorcist, it was in reaction and response to the growing increase in the occult in Europe. 25%, it's been estimated, 25% of the people in Italy practice the occult. In a country that's 97% Catholic, only 3% worship. 25% practice the occult. Now that number was given to me when I took the course. The course was somewhat academic. It was a survey course, and it looked at demonology and cults from a legal point of view, a media point of view, a technological point of view. We brought exorcists in for a couple of panel discussions. There was a whole thing done on entertainment in the media and Satanists, who oftentimes are some of our best known musical artists, and the lyrics that sometimes are on the songs that they have made millions of dollars for. It was a series of 10 sessions, and then I went and I found an exorcist, and that was all my own doing. But in the course, 25% of the people practice the occult. And the occult is not the same thing as the satanic. When we talk about the occult, O-C-C-U-L-T, we talk about activities and rituals that are pagan. There's a lot of paganism going on in our country. And there's a lot of paganism that goes on in the world. So people who get involved or dabble or are curious about witchcraft, black magic, white magic, palm reading, seances, tarot cards, crystals, spells, all of that and more. That's all Wicca. That's all in the realm of the occult. And that is a broad term that has to do with putting other pagan/spiritual tracks that are really not of God as a supreme being, but other kinds of ritual as ways to get answers to questions, or to somehow become disciples of certain kinds of activities that do not have Father, Son, and Spirit as the supreme being. All of those occult-like practices, those are doorways to the demonic. They're not the same thing as the demonic, but they're doorways. When I'm in the discernment mode with somebody, and someone calls, and I agree to see them, and they come in, and we do initial prayer, I ask them 2 questions. What has brought you to see me today? What event brought you to see me today? And then I listen to what they have to say. And then I say, when was the first time that happened to you? And then I begin to build a kind of a composite portrait. And I ask a lot of questions. Now, if you go to your doctor, when you go to your doctor can't help you until you tell him where the pain is, or you tell him the symptoms. What I do is the same thing, but the reason I call it a discernment is because I'm superimposing faith over all those questions.